Hey heroes, and welcome to another invincible episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Supervillains. The Marvel Universe is filled with them. Some are powerful, intimidating, or outright terrifying, while others are not so much. This week we're taking a look at another selection of strange and obscure supervillains who probably won't be taking over the world anytime soon. Let's start with a weird one. Early in the Marvel Age, there was an incident in which an ordinary beetle was irradiated during an atomic experiment and gained a significant intellect, as well as the ability to control other arthropods. Dubbed the Scarlet Beetle based on his red coloration, he began gathering insect forces with the goal of launching an attack on mankind, overwhelming them with sheer numbers, but his schemes caught the attention of the original Ant-Man, Hank Pym, whose command over ants specifically was more powerful than the Scarlet Beetle's. In their initial conflict, the Scarlet Beetle succeeded in stealing Ant-Man's enlarging gas and grew to roughly human size. In the end, however, Pym defeated his insect opponent and not only returned the Scarlet Beetle to normal size, but counteracted the mutagenic effects of the radiation, removing the beetle's heightened intelligence before releasing it back into the wild. However, residue from the growth gas left latent Pym particles in the Scarlet Beetle's body, and later it started to grow even larger than before, unable to control it due to its lack of intelligence. This time it was opposed by Spider-Man and the amateur vigilante Bluebird, who used gas-filled ether eggs to knock the beetle out, causing it to return to normal size so quickly that the heroes lost sight of it. Furthermore, Pym's attempt to remove the Scarlet Beetle's abilities and intellect eventually proved to be temporary, as the insect returned years later, claiming that it was a mutant with a lifespan that far exceeded other members of its species. Unable to grow without more Pym particles, it attempted to steal Ant-Man's enlarging gas once again. However, by this point the hero had altered his formula so that it couldn't be used by anyone other than himself. This time the two fought beneath a candy store where the disgruntled shopkeep just so happened to be attempting to set fire to the building as part of an insurance scam, and so this battle ended when one of Pym's ants caused the shopkeep to drop his kerosene can, seemingly crushing the Scarlet Beetle. Of course, the wily bug survived yet again, and was subsequently employed by the Soviet agent Madam X, another enemy of Hank Pym's, who at the time was leading a group called the People's Security Forces in Hungary. During this time, the insect menace led a small horde of human-sized Scarlet Beetles who were presumably either cloned from the original or simply mutated in a similar fashion. When the Scarlet Beetle was later interviewed on the television show Inside the Monster's Lair, he was asked about this but neglected to provide any sort of clarification or explanation. In any event, this horde was completely wiped out in a confrontation with the West Coast Avengers. Surprisingly resilient, the Scarlet Beetle has continued to sporadically pop up over the years. In one instance, he somehow got his hands on a swarm of insectoid robots and clashed with the Sensational She-Hulk. The Scarlet Beetle piloted a particularly large one of these alien-like robots. However, a dose of bug spray was enough to put him off balance long enough for She-Hulk to rip off the robot's head, exposing the Scarlet Beetle's cockpit in the neck, after which he was quickly swatted with a newspaper wielded by the She-Hulk's father, Morris Walters. The Scarlet Beetle has also clashed with Hank Pym's successor, Scott Lang, on at least 2 separate occasions, and while he's been defeated each time, it's probably only a matter of time before he pops up yet again. Next, let's turn our attention towards an Australian man named Frank Oliver. Fascinated by kangaroos, he spent his vacation time in the outback studying and emulating the animals, including their diet, until his leaping prowess matched theirs. I will note that official handbooks have posited that Oliver's superhuman leg muscles were actually the result of a genetic mutation that he himself was unaware of. Whatever the true source of his power, he tried to profit from his newfound strength as a boxer, but when he delivered a kick that severely injured his opponent, possibly even fatally, Frank Oliver attempted to flee the country. He stowed away on a ship and made it to the United States, and despite briefly being detained as an illegal alien, he ultimately escaped from custody and decided that if he was going to be treated like a criminal, then he would truly become one. He attempted to launch a villainous career as the Kangaroo, stealing what he assumed to be a case containing valuables of some kind from a group of armed guards. In truth, the case carried a carefully sealed canister containing a deadly live bacteria sample that was being used in scientific study, but fortunately disaster was averted when the Kangaroo was defeated by Spider-Man, who ensured the bacteria was not released. But because the hero needed to get the dangerous vial back where it belonged safely, the Kangaroo was able to leap away. Humiliated and depressed, Oliver wandered the streets of New York for months before he was found by a disgraced doctor-turned-criminal scientist, Jonas Harrow. The mad surgeon convinced Oliver to undergo a series of operations that greatly augmented his natural abilities, allowing him to punch through solid concrete or leap up to 100 yards. Initially, the Kangaroo betrayed Harrow by refusing to help the Mad Doctor with his own plans in return. Oliver attempted to use his increased strength to strike back at Spider-Man, but Harrow had already implanted a device in his head that forced his obedience by causing severe pain. Harrow sent the Kangaroo to steal a radioactive isotope from a nuclear laboratory on the Hudson River, but despite Spider-Man's attempts to warn him, Frank Oliver foolishly forced his way into a highly radioactive section of the facility and perished in a matter of seconds. Despite his short-lived and frankly ignominious criminal career, Frank Oliver evidently had one superfan, an American interior designer named Brian Hibbs, who spent years training himself to mimic his idol's abilities. Becoming the new Kangaroo, he spent time in Mississippi quietly working for the Corporation, a criminal enterprise we've mentioned on the channel before, but when he later attempted to make his public debut in New York, he was defeated by a single punch from Spider-Man. The beneficiary of a trust fund, Hibbs then spent roughly half of his fortune obtaining a seemingly high-tech battlesuit from the Sharper villain catalog. However, this proved to be a waste of money as the Kangaroo armor was destroyed by its own faulty weapon systems. Hibbs was then recruited into a group calling themselves the Spider-Man Revenge Squad, but is more colloquially known as the Legion of Losers, alongside the Spot, the Grizzly, and the Gibbon. However, this team fell apart when Grizzly and Gibbon had second thoughts about the whole endeavor and ended up turning on the other two. Embarrassed and frustrated by his humiliating defeats, Hibbs began seriously building up his fighting skills and sought ways of obtaining superhuman abilities of his own, subjecting himself to experimental treatments. When this failed to yield results, he pursued a career as a professional baseball player under the false name Billy Bob Jenks, but was ousted from the league when his true identity was discovered. He was later incarcerated in a supervillain prison called The Cage, where the fighting skills he learned actually earned him some respect due to the use of power-dampening technology that eliminated the superhuman abilities of the other inmates. Furthermore, it seems that the stress and physical exertion that came with prison life catalyzed his earlier attempts at superhuman mutation, causing him to grow significantly larger and stronger. As a side effect, however, his intelligence was noticeably lessened, and he began speaking in a comically thick Australian accent while believing that he was really the original Kangaroo, Frank Oliver. During this time, he had a brief but intense rivalry with a much more notable and successful criminal, Tombstone. Since that whole debacle, he has returned to something resembling his original size and intellect, and while he occasionally pops up dressed like Frank Oliver, these days he most often wears a more functional version of his kangaroo battlesuit, while continuing to embark on a life of crime. As a side note, there was also a villain called the Kangaroo Man in the early 1940s who battled the original Human Torch and his sidekick Toro. Also known as the Kangaroo Killer, this kangaroo was an Australian scientist who, in 1938, developed a chemical compound that caused human blood to be transmuted into gasoline. He brought this discovery to his half-brother Jock Jordan, hoping to get funding for further experiments, but Jordan was horrified by the implications of effectively using human blood as a fuel source. Then, after the start of the Second World War, the Kangaroo Man struck a deal with Japanese agents who ordered him to kill his half-brother, thus eliminating the only other person who knew about his formula. In 1943, he carried out this mission using boomerangs coated in his chemical compound. However, this peculiar murder was then investigated by the Human Torch. The Kangaroo Killer's criminal career also came to an abrupt and ignominious end when he attempted to hit the Torch's partner, Toro the Flame Kid, with his poisoned boomerang, but missed his target and was struck with his own projectile upon its return. With his blood slowly becoming flammable and only minutes left to live, the Kangaroo Man lit one last cigarette, causing his entire body to burst into flames, and the secret of his peculiar formula died with him. For our next tale, let's turn our attention towards an atomic scientist named Frederick Beechman and a cleaning woman named Gemma Sinclair, both of whom worked at a nuclear research facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico. One fateful day, a fault in the facility's electrical system caused an accidental radiation leak, and while Beechman and Sinclair were exposed to a massive dose of radiation, both individuals survived with seemingly no ill effects. Then, 1 year later, Frederick's wife, Emily, gave birth to a mutant son who they named Jerome Beechman. In addition to unusually dark skin for a child of two Caucasian parents, Jerome had tufts of long, dark hair all over his tiny body. Similarly, about a year after that, Gemma Sinclair gave birth to a daughter with chalk-white skin, despite both her and her husband being African American. This baby girl, Nekra Sinclair, was not technically an albino, but rather another mutant, as evidenced by her vampire-like fangs. Now, this is a phenomenon we've mentioned on the channel before, but while those possessing mutant X genes most often gain superhuman powers during puberty, sometimes undergoing an outward transformation in the process, there have been multiple instances of physical aspects of mutation being present from birth, in cases where the parents were exposed to some form of nuclear radiation prior to conception. In any event, as children, both Jerome Beechman and Nekra Sinclair were ostracized by their respective communities for their peculiar appearances, and both grew to resent the United States itself, regarding it as a land where hatred and oppression were allowed to foster. Jerome also grew increasingly ape-like as he aged, and when he was only 10 years old, his father abandoned him in the New Mexico desert, ostensibly leaving him there to die. Frederick would later claim that his wife Emily had convinced him to do this, and that he had intentionally left their son near a water source in the hopes that he would survive. Meanwhile, the similarly aged Nekra Sinclair ran away from home, and the two mutant children just so happened to run into each other for the first time. Each considering the other a kindred spirit, Nekra and Jerome grew close quickly, although neither suspected that this was at least in part due to Jerome's emerging pheromone powers. They spent the remainder of their childhoods wandering the American Southwest together, stealing whatever they needed to survive and educating themselves with pilfered textbooks. They shunned the rest of humanity, but then, after 6 years together, the two were found by a lynch mob in Missouri, who regarded them as monsters. In the ensuing conflict, Nekra's mutant abilities manifested for the first time. In short, by harnessing her own violent emotions, Nekra Sinclair could endow herself with superhuman strength and durability. For example, the hatred she felt towards her attackers made her tough enough to shrug off bullets without injury. While not as strong as an enraged Nekra, Jerome's mutation also afforded him a level of superhuman strength, and the two quickly dispatched the angry mob. After that experience, the two were no longer content to run and hide, and decided to use their superhuman powers to strike back at humanity. Furthermore, they soon realized that Jerome had the mutant ability to control women through his hypnotic pheromones. Around this time, Jerome adopted the alias Mandrill after the animal he had grown to resemble. Using his pheromone powers, the two started their own cult that espoused the power of hate and recruited a small army of brainwashed women who worshipped Mandrill like a god, while Nekra acted as his high priestess. Members of this cult even tattooed their faces with the mark of the Mandrill. At some point during all of this, Mandrill also apparently earned a favor from the Japanese crime lord Shingen Harada. However, the circumstances surrounding this are unrevealed. Mandrill and Nekra subsequently embarked on a plan to overthrow several small African nations where they could begin building their own utopia. As part of this scheme, Mandrill attempted to recruit others to his cause, willingly or otherwise. However, this led to a conflict with the African-born jungle adventurer Shanna O'Hara, aka Shanna the She-Devil, who proved resistant to the Mandrill's pheromones. With help from the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Jakuna Singh, Shanna took Mandrill into custody. However, his cult had already taken her father, Gerald O'Hara, prisoner, and Mandrill refused to reveal where he was being held. Shanna also subsequently clashed with Nekra, and while outmatched in terms of raw strength, the She-Devil proved herself to be the more capable fighter, outmaneuvering her rampaging opponent and using pressure points to choke her out. Shanna attempted to interrogate Nekra and learn her father's location, but she also refused to talk. Furthermore, before Shanna could turn Nekra over to S.H.I.E.L.D., the sinister mutant escaped, killing Shanna's ally, Patrick McShane, in the process. Making matters worse, Lord Shingen repaid his debt to the Mandrill by sending his son, Kenichiro Harada, aka the Silver Samurai, to free him from custody. After murdering Gerald O'Hara as part of a plot to steal his fortune, Mandrill and Nekra reorganized their cult into a terrorist organization called Black Spectre. In an ongoing campaign to create chaos and sow confusion in the United States, Black Spectre instigated race riots and defaced American monuments with Nazi iconography, including placing a swastika atop the Washington Monument and adding Adolf Hitler's face to Mount Rushmore. They were opposed by the Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff. However, Nekra overpowered her in their first encounter, and Mandrill subsequently used his powers to brainwash her into joining them. Black Spectre also clashed with the likes of Ben Grimm, aka The Thing, and Daredevil. Mandrill even learned Daredevil's secret identity of Matt Murdock from Black Widow, and successfully captured Shanna the She-Devil thanks to the Silver Samurai. Mandrill intended on dissecting her brain in an attempt to learn how she was able to resist him, and while Daredevil was briefly captured as well while trying to free her, he ultimately helped Black Widow free herself from Mandrill's control and escaped with both women. Mandrill and Nekra, meanwhile, began the final phases of their plans and attempted to take control of the White House. Of course, they were opposed once again by Daredevil, Black Widow, and Shanna the She-Devil. This time, the Widow succeeded in subduing Nekra by causing her concentration to break, rendering her momentarily vulnerable. Daredevil, meanwhile, fought Mandrill on the roof of the White House, but inadvertently kicked the villain over the edge. In the end, while Nekra was taken into custody along with the unwilling members of Black Spectre, Mandrill survived the fall and escaped. After that defeat, Mandrill quickly gathered more followers, forming a new group of women called Femme Force. He also hired a team of mutant mercenaries appropriately called Mutant Force. This group included Byron Calley, aka Burner, who could psionically induce combustion, Ned Lathrop, aka Lifter, who could increase his body's density, gaining superhuman strength in the process, Peter Quinn, aka Peeper, who had telescopic vision and could fire destructive eye beams, Randall Darby, aka Shocker, who could generate bioelectricity and project it from his claw-like hands, and Aaron Salomon, aka Slither, whose long snake-like body and limbs could coil around his opponents. Weirdly enough, before being employed by the Mandrill, this team briefly served Magneto as a short-lived incarnation of the Brotherhood. However, he abandoned them after a single mission in which they failed to defeat Captain America. Anyway, Mandrill sent Femforce and Mutant Force to steal the gold reserves from a Colorado military installation, and while he was opposed by a team of defenders, this allowed him to bring two of the heroes under his control, Valkyrie and Hellcat. In the wake of this, Valkyrie was put in charge of the Mandrill's forces despite some protests from Lifter, who resented taking orders from a woman. Mandrill also briefly captured the Wasp, but she was rescued by a girl named Diane Wilkins, who was too young for the villain's pheromones to fully affect her, but feigned subservience long enough to help the Wasp escape, while ensuring the size-changing hero never breathed in the Mandrill's musk. Meanwhile, another defender, Nighthawk, freed Hellcat and Valkyrie from Mandrill's control by dropping them into an electro-organic field that shocked them back to their senses. In the end, the defenders defeated and apprehended Mutant Force, however, Mandrill himself escaped again. The villain later returned with what remained of Femforce in an attempt to take revenge on Daredevil and the Defenders, and even abducted his own parents with the intention of forcing his mother to serve as a figurehead in his new nation. He attempted to take over the Aeroshaft nuclear facility in New York, and while a number of superheroes rallied against him, ironically in the end it was his own mother, Emily Beachman, who stopped him with a shot from a rifle that seemingly ended his life. Of course, Mandrill survived, as villains tend to do, and has continued to pop up occasionally over the years. However, his near-death experience seemingly left him hesitant to make any further attempts at domination or nation-building. Instead, he mostly focuses on petty crimes and self-gratification, and while he sometimes works for other villains like the Hood, these days it's pretty common to see him filling a cell in any one of the various supervillain prisons that have been built over the years. All in all, a fairly precipitous drop in reputation for someone who was once a threat on a national scale. I will note that his former sister-in-arms, Nekra, has had a somewhat more notable history after the two parted ways, so perhaps we'll come back to her story another time. For now, let's end off today's video with another quick one by looking at a petty criminal named Mortimer George Norris. Born in Alton, Illinois, Mort Norris eventually moved to New York City, where he found employment under a Maggia crime family. For one job, he was tasked with retrieving a radioactive isotope while it was being transported. Norris shot the driver and began looting the truck, but inadvertently irradiated himself when he mishandled the isotope. Dizzy and feverish, he ended up falling into the East River, and when he emerged hours later, a combination of radiation and pollution had mutated him into a green, scaly form. Soon discovering that his bizarre transformation had endowed him with a level of superhuman strength, Norris was put in charge of Maggia operations within a limited part of the city, and soon became known as Mr. Fish, adopting the trademark catchphrase, "Nobody laughs at Mr. Fish." He had a number of underlings at his command, the most loyal of which was a diminutive fellow with a thick southern accent, Jorge Mote, better known as Shrike. His protection racket and extortion schemes soon ruffled the feathers of several trucking business owners, and when their attempts to resist him left one of them with a noticeable scar on his chest, the truckers contacted the hero for hire, Luke Cage, aka Power Man, to deal with the problem. Naturally, this all culminated in a battle between Luke Cage and Mr. Fish, and while Norris attempted to kill his bulletproof opponent by forcing him off the edge of a 25-story building, Mr. Fish ended up falling to his own doom, and thus marked the end of Mr. Fish's short-lived criminal career. At least until his brother Bill Norris was coincidentally mutated in exactly the same way and became the new Mr. Fish. He hasn't exactly made a name for himself, but every so often he can be spotted alongside other New York-based villains. Anyway, that is all I have for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And that being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!